So for this assignment, the myth that I'm choosing to debunk is the idea that speed reading can build comprehension. And one of the reasons that I chose this myth was because growing up I was a struggling reader, and in order to try and help me, my mom enrolled me in summer reading classes where the goal was speed reading to build comprehension. And I remember that I did become a better reader from just repeated readings of texts, and just the idea of practicing reading every day, of course that builds a better reader. But I do remember not really still having the struggle with understanding what I was reading, and it was a lower level skill of just read this to read it but not to really talk about what you read. So I thought that this was really appropriate, and especially since I teach 4 different reading groups a day, I thought that this would be important to my practice. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the inaccurate pieces that go with speed reading, and then I'll move on to talking about some of the accurate sides of speed reading. So to start, one of the biggest things that I thought that kind of went against speed reading is that we talk a lot about, as educators, reading is thinking, and when you're doing reading, you're doing a lot of different processes. You're making connections, you're inferring, you're predicting, you're asking yourself questions, you're clarifying, you're finding context clues, you're doing so many things. And if you're reading a text at, 1,800 words a minute is what one of our sources talked about. I mean, you're not really thinking, you're not taking reading to a deeper level, and that's kind of the goal of reading, essentially, is we want kids to make big connections. We want them to compare the text to another text or to their life, and if you're asking kids to read as fast as they can, they're not going to be doing that. And if you are reading at a fast pace, you really can't comprehend the way you could be comprehending if you were reading a little bit slower, if you were going back and you were rereading, if you were taking breaks to visualize what you read or talk it out with a partner. It's not the same academic process. And then one of the things that I found kind of interesting in one of our sources was that speed readers who have been tested for their speed reading ability, occasionally the tests have allegedly been kind of rigged so that the pre-test would be harder than the post-test, so that their results reflected kind of this inflated idea. And so I thought that that was kind of interesting to note. So moving on to some of the pros of speed reading, just working with a text and rereading a text multiple times, and just any type of practice with reading obviously improves reading. So, having kids in groups who, doing these 1-minute timings that in my school district we do at the beginning of every year, and we do progress monitor monthly. We do see improvement because they are reading and we're tracking that throughout the year. So that is important. We see that these kids who read really fast become really good at turning pages, and that was mentioned in the source on debunking speed reading, is that you get really good at turning pages. There's also a debunked claim about this idea of subvocalization, which is that little reader brain, that little voice that you hear when you're reading, that if you suppress that voice and you just continue on reading, that you'll read faster. But it's actually, we need that voice in our brain because it stops us when we're confused. It makes us go back and reread. It tells us in our brain if we don't quite understand how to pronounce a word. And so suppressing that goes back to the idea that reading is thinking. If we're not allowing that little reader voice in our brain to be heard, then we're not really going to reach our potential as readers. And one of the other pros of speed reading is that you're able to become really good at making inferences about what you read, really reasonable inferences about what you read, because you're picking up maybe some ideas and some key phrases and words and using your background to construct this summary or this idea about what you read. And so now when I was reading all of this, it's all about speed and going fast, and it reminded me from chapter 9 in Carrie all about the PLMs, the perceptual learning modules, where if you want to learn something really quickly with our perceptual learning brain, that you're gonna eventually get it down. And I thought that that kind of related back to this whole idea of reading fast and doing it fast. I think that speed reading could potentially lead to fluency and just becoming a better reader because you're just reading more. I think that it's going to limit your comprehension and it's going to limit what you're supposed to be doing as readers. But that did remind me of the whole chapter on perceptual learning. So when I tie all this together with neuroscience and how people learn, I read Improving Students' Learning with Effective Learning Techniques. And one of the strategies that was talked about in this article was the use of imagery for text learning. And so what they had students do was they had students read this really, I think it was like 36-page science article. And they had students stop at every paragraph to imagine what they read and take breaks on what they read, and to stop and mentally imagine what the text was telling them. And then they were given a test, a multiple choice test, where the answers were not obvious. They were very inference based, so they were very similar in phrasing. There wasn't any major distractors in the answer choices. And the students who stopped to do that imagining of what they read did significantly better than students who didn't. And I thought that tied really big into what I talked about earlier about how reading is thinking, and we need to take breaks as readers to stop and to infer and to connect and to clarify and to question and do all of those big ideas that are really important. The article Improving Students' Learning with Effective Learning Techniques also talked about how important rereading is as a self-regulated tool. It talked about how rereading affects the process of higher level thinking, and that connects back to everything that I was saying, and how students who are academically successful oftentimes do go back and reread. And the idea that going back to reread leads to higher level thinking, it's because you're noticing things that you didn't notice before as a reader, and you're making connections. And the first time you read, you're getting the gist, but when you go back and you dig deeper, you're really close reading, which is a huge push in education today to teach kids how to be close readers. And so, for this assignment, it was really interesting to read about some of the pros and some of the cons about this myth. And ultimately, I think speed reading is not an effective practice, but I do see that there is some benefit to it. Any reading is good reading. I don't think that this would be something that I would teach in my classroom, but I do see the benefit of reading and just doing repeated readings as a whole. So thank you for listening.